every detail you might have missed in Donkey Kong Bonanza. The original demo for Donkey Kong Bonanza was actually made within the Mario Odyssey engine using a primitive design of the Goomba with giant hands being able to take apart the rocks and throw them around. And the way that they did this is that they took the hands from the boss of Mario Odyssey called Knucklotech, attached them to a Goomba, and then based it on the same kind of voxel technology that we saw in the Cheese Rocks in Luncheon Kingdom, as well as the snow in Shiveria. And because the game was developed all the way back then, it was originally planned to be a Switch 1 game, but was eventually repurposed for the Switch 2 later on, much in the same way that it happened for Mario Kart World. And here we have early screenshots showing a graphics comparison between the Nintendo Switch and the Nintendo Switch 2, where the Switch 2 version has a lot more different kinds of foliage than we're seeing on the Switch 1. But also interesting to me is that we could see an entirely different form for how the Bonanzas would have looked, instead being switched with the L bumper as opposed to what we're seeing now, where it's done with the D-pad. Alright, and against Diddy and Dixie Kong in the racing layer, if you pay attention to this big U-turn, you can see the words Double Trouble are written on the side, which is of course a reference to Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. And while you're down there in the racing layer, one of the tracks that you'll see, Ramby Rumble, is a reference to a level from Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest. While we obviously have returning characters with Diddy and Dixie Kong, that's not the only references that we'll see down here in the racing layer. Consider that when you talk to Dixie Kong, she mentions just how jealous Candy Kong would be to know that all three of them are meeting up again. And if you keep talking to her, she'll also recount the events of Donkey Kong Country 2, where she mentions that her and Diddy Kong had to go and rescue you. It's a bit of a gruesome detail, but some of the different fossils that you collect in Donkey Kong Bonanza are actually direct references to certain characters from the series. Those including Winky the Frog, Zinger, Naughty, and Professor Chops. Which, if they're showing up in the fossil record, I think that makes the timeline even more confusing for this game. That or they just look eerily close to their ancestors. Either way, it's still kinda gross. Cranky Kong is another returning character that you'll find across multiple different layers in the game, and because he's a fan favorite character returning again, it makes sense that he would make a lot of references, including a reminder to the fact that he's the original Donkey Kong from the arcade game. But also hidden amongst his dialogue is a reference calling himself the leader of the bunch, referring back to the DK rap from DK64, which you can also listen to playing from the speakers when you unlock the different getaways. Listen closely to this portion of the end credits theme, since it actually uses a part of the tune that's directly inspired by Donkey Kong Country's original theme. While breaking crates in the early part of the game, pay attention to the logo on the side, since what we can find here is that it actually mentions New Donk City as part of the label, which is fitting in more ways than one for how the game ends up, not just for the fact that Pauline returns here, as she does in the mayor of New Donk City. When taking one of Quiztone's quizzes in the resort layer, he makes a direct reference to oranges exploding, which is another reference to Donkey Kong 64 with the orange grenades that we saw in that game, where you can actually throw the oranges to take down different kinds of enemies. Makes sense as we're a lot more peaceful in the resort layer. If you were to pay attention to the different forms of signage that we see inside of New Donk City, then you'll notice not only a reference to Lanky Kong and Jungle Japes, but also this poster, which serves as a reference to the original opening of Donkey Kong Country, where Cranky Kong's hanging out playing into his gramophone, before the new Donkey Kong swings in and starts up the game with new kickin' music. While there are multiple sub-levels that are direct references to the Donkey Kong Country levels of the past, literally called Nostalgia Country, one of the most interesting ones is that you're actually able to jump up here into the treehouse at the beginning of this stage to earn yourself a Banandium gem. And that's not the only reference here, since if you were to take this barrel at the end of the level and shoot yourself into the side of the cliff face, then it will reward you by giving you a whole bunch of gold as well, which is a direct reference to what would happen in the original Donkey Kong Country level. When you work with the elders to get yourself the different Bonanza power-ups, pay attention to Pauline's dance moves, since this sidestep move that we're seeing here is actually a direct reference to the ways that she used to move originally in the arcade title. And that's not the only reference to the arcade title, but first we gotta talk about the final boss fight. Once you fought King K. Rool, you know that the boss fight actually has multiple phases. And this fake out is actually a direct reference to how it was when you tried to take him down in the past. Even down to having all of the credits start with the letter K. And then the second stage of the final fight, the flying machine that he uses is very similar to the one that we saw back in Donkey Kong Country 3. Finally taking us all the way over to the final stage of the fight, where when you're fighting King K. Rool, the whole thing takes place inside of a boxing ring, evoking what we saw back in Donkey Kong 64. Now, amongst all the different outfits that we can collect for Pauline and Donkey Kong, you can find direct references to her outfits that she wore in Super Mario Odyssey, as well as the original arcade outfit for the lady design, as well as her original arcade outfit based around when she had blonde hair. And in fact, if you have hands on the amiibo that launched with the game, you can even unlock the Diva outfit that way without having to go and spend any fossils. And it's not just that the sublevels are based off of the Donkey Kong Country stages visually, but they also go ahead and recreate the soundtrack as well. Most importantly, the iconic sticker brush symphony that we hear during Bramble Country. If you were to go idle next to a chair in the game, then you'll notice that after a while, DK will actually sit down on it, just just as long as you don't break it first. Much like in Mario Odyssey, the tech for moving around in this game is getting even more complex by the day. And one of the simple examples of this is that if we were to do the roll move, a jump, and then another roll in succession, that's an easy way to increase your travel distance in the air. And with the help of chunk jumps that we're seeing from the speedrun community, it's now possible with the right amount of attacking and ZL pressing that we can actually chain this together to get an infinite amount of jumping, which is a term called IFAT, coming from the name Infinite Fast Area Turf. And it's so game-breaking that you can skip entire Bananza power-ups without even having to worry about it. If you pay close attention to DK's fur when you store up on Bananergy, then you'll notice that before you go into Kong Bananza form, you actually get more orange when full up on Bananergy. It's a bit hard to see, and especially if you're switching over to different fur types, but looking at a direct comparison like so, it does stand out. If you're looking for a little bit of extra lore in the game, then you can go and read these signs that are scattered around the different layers. However, if you're gonna go read them, make sure you're not standing behind them, because there's actually a separate dialogue that the game will play, reminding you that you can't read the sign from behind. And of course, if you were to go and break it into bits, you can't read it then either. But you could always just restore the terrain and then read it that way. If you pay extra close attention to the treehouse Easter egg, then you might notice this red retro television that's standing out in the background, which ends up being a fun reference to when King K. Rool was initially revealed for Smash Bros. When you're plummeting down to the next layer, and while Pauline's talking to you, you don't actually have to follow the traditional tunnel path. And instead, because we can destroy the terrain, we can actually go off the beaten path and gain even more bits of gold that are hanging out in pockets on the outside of the tunnel. While you're fully able to run past the boss after beating them, it's actually possible to interact with the different bosses that we're seeing that worked for Void Co., giving you multiple chances to talk to both Poppy Kong and Grumpy Kong after you defeat them. If you get too close to a friendly NPC and accidentally press the punch button, yeah, accidentally, then luckily it'll only cause them to get either a fist bump or a high five. Yeah, nice try. Much like in Mario Odyssey, the different ways that Mario would react to the different climates, whether it's too hot or too cold, you'll notice that DK will act accordingly, either by shivering or sweating in the hot environments. If you pay close attention, it's easy to miss, but each different type of terrain that you rip out has a different sound effect associated with it. Take a listen. When befriending Oddrock at the beginning of the game, when DK whistles the song, it's actually the counter melody for the original Donkey Kong Country theme. And here's what that counter melody would sound like when it was played with the original melody of the actual theme. When you first run into Cranky Kong in the Lagoon layer, he actually makes a reference to Mario, saying, "Back in my day, rivals had charisma," and overalls. When you rotate the camera and take a look at Pauline, you notice that when you hold down the bumper, she actually both whistles or sings the proper words for the lyrics on your shoulder, which is a fun detail, especially considering most of us wouldn't actually ever get to see this because we're facing the wrong way. One of the last pieces of clothing to collect for DK is a specially designed piece called the Girded Breeches, which not only reduce damage from thorns and spikes, making them useful for the end stages, but they also themselves are direct reference to how the original Donkey Kong arcade game looked. The sound effect you get for using the Zebra Bananza form is the same as traversing electric lines in Mario Odyssey, which you can hear a comparison here. Here's Donkey Kong Bananza, and here's Mario Odyssey. If you take a look at these hidden maps in the game, then you'll notice that they reveal the map from Donkey Kong Country 3 when you view them in the photo mode, which I think is awesome. For one, just even including photo mode inside of this is cool, but having it play into different hidden details, that's next level. If you were to pick up some soft terrain like mud and throw it at the Fractones, you can attach it to their body even when they're hidden. And this example from Reddit shows off how they were able to throw a whole bunch of sand onto the end of the Fractone, which they hadn't even been able to see yet. And then this also shows how the soft terrain can ultimately become a part of the Fractone's body. Like this example from Super Mario Broth where they were able to make a full zebra cube. With the help of sequence breaking, it's possible to use a chunk jump to get yourself past this point in Ingot Isle Cave-In where you normally shouldn't be able to reach when you don't have Oddrock. And in fact, the game even notices this and gives you a specific kind of dialogue when you do this. If you talk to one of the fellow chimps up top, "Hey DK, hate to say it, but we still have 0 leads, but I think something's happening over that way. Go over and check it out." Which I think is just awesome to see that they even planned for this weird example. But considering people were able to find this just a few short weeks after the game came out, then they probably expected that it was going to get this crazy. Because Donkey Kong's able to climb any terrain without having any kind of stamina, it's possible that if you take the rainbow goop that you find in the resort layer, you could build yourself a bridge up to this point and then lift off before finally attaching to the side of the watermelon and basically skipping the whole resort layer. While it's not obvious in the menu, you are able to reset your skill points if you didn't like what you classed into. And the way that you do this is that you talk with the different elders after you've gotten gotten their Bananza form. If you're like me, then you're probably confused why your jump button's bound to A in this game, as opposed to the B button that we're used to in other games like Mario Odyssey. Well, you can swap this easily within the settings of the game, just by scrolling down here and then toggling the switch. Which is good, because the alternative would have been having to change it on your system-wide settings for the Switch, which is possible, but a bit annoying. By using a manipulation of the photo mode, it's possible to disable this collision above the Kong Elder and glitch yourself away from where you would usually hatch Oddrock into Pauline. And while we can't go and beat the rest of the game this way, it is funny that you start to hear Pauline's voice lines coming out of Oddrock. But since we didn't get the Bananza form, the boss never actually spawns, making it possible to get here, but impossible to beat. The way that Pauline's voice lines works is that she'll always point out an apple before she points out anything else, which makes sense. She wants to make sure that you get health. But as these Reddit users found out, that actually creates a weird issue where sometimes if you approach a banana but there was an apple off screen, she'll make a reference to the apple and accidentally call the banana an apple. And with that, folks, YouTube thinks that you might like this video, so see if they're right and have a good one, alright?